Wonderful, and thank you everyone for being here. It looks like we have a big crowd. We're happy and excited to share this research with you. So I'm going to be covering our introduction, giving some background about why studying tree mortality is important and why studying yard trees in particular is important. And then I'll dive into this 5-year recent study from the Sacramento Shade Program. I'll turn it over to Yekang, who will talk about a 22-year survival and growth study that stretches back to the early days of that same program. And then Pete will close out with the Energy Saving Trees program out of the Arbor Day Foundation and some recent data that they have collected. So why study tree mortality? As I'm sure all of you on this webinar are aware, the Million Tree campaigns have really taken off over the last decade in the US and even around the world. And whether we're talking about planting 100 trees or 1,000,000 trees, often the motivation is discussed in terms of changing things, that we want to increase the number of trees or we want to increase canopy cover. And often the justification comes back to ecosystem services and projecting future environmental benefits. This price tag is a kind of sign you might see if you attend an arboriculture conference, saying that this tree will give us back a certain amount, a dollar value of environmental benefits over the next 15 years. And so what's interesting to me is what happens if that tree dies, or what happens if many trees from that group of trees that were planted by the city or by a nonprofit, what if many of them die? What are the implications of that in terms of managing the urban forest and being realistic about future environmental benefits? So here's a example from Greg McPherson's research. He did a cost-benefit analysis and some projections for the Los Angeles Million Tree campaign. And this graph here is showing survivorship. That's the proportion of trees surviving out of those planted versus time since planting. And that dashed line is 35 years, which was the time horizon being discussed in the study. And the high mortality scenario versus the low mortality scenario is just an enormous difference. In the high mortality scenario that he used in those projections, we had 58% of trees dead at 35 years. The low mortality scenario, only 18% dead. And what's important is that when this work was done, there weren't past studies to cite to discuss what real empirical data would be to feed into these projections. Now, Greg later went back and used some data on establishment survival from the trees planted in LA, and it turns out that the real tree survival is closer to that high mortality scenario. So that's one reason to study tree mortality, so that we can be more realistic in these cost-benefit calculations and these projections going forward. But even aside from those sophisticated models, we can also use realistic expectations about tree loss to plan ahead for population cycles, to plan ahead for tree removal and replacement. And last, by doing analysis of mortality outcomes for different kind of factors that might be associated with mortality, we can learn what kinds of trees, what kinds of situations are most at risk for tree loss, tree mortality, and for slow growth, and we can start trying to target program improvements for those at-risk trees. So then why study yard trees in particular? So there isn't very much literature out there on urban tree mortality to begin with, but what is available is mostly about street trees. Street trees are quite honestly just a little easier to study. You don't need permission to get into someone's yard. And why then yard trees? Why did Yekang and I spend so much effort getting all this data about yard trees? So one thing is that yards and lawns are the primary point of contact between many urban residents and nature. These are the lawns, these are the environments where people live. Next, yard tree distribution programs, they operate so differently from street tree planting programs. We're talking about getting trees onto people's private land, not land that is managed and owned by the city, not the public right-of-way. And that in many programs, those that are giveaway or distribution programs, we're actually relying on the residents to not only care for trees after planting, but also to plant that tree in the first place. We're trusting that this resident is going to take a tree home or get a tree delivered to them and actually do good things with it to ensure its success. And next, yard tree programs are really essential to meet canopy cover and planting campaign goals. And this is shown in my next slide here that has a table of tree canopy cover data, UTC data. It's from the LIDAR-derived urban tree canopy assessment, and this table is thanks to Dexter Locke. He and I are working on a separate paper about yard tree programs in the northeastern U.S. And what you see here is that, for example, in Philadelphia's existing tree canopy is 20%. Of that 20%, 23% of it is on residential land. And then Philadelphia has the possibility for another 49% canopy cover. And of that additional possible canopy cover, 24% of it is on residential land. And that same kind of story repeats for each of these cities, where the residential out of existing current canopy and the residential out of possible new canopy is either the first or second most highest type of land cover for all of these cities. So these different cities have all initiated tree distribution programs for yards in order to increase their canopy cover. So with that background, I'm going to launch into the 5-year survival study from Sacramento Shade. So the Sacramento Shade program is the largest and longest operating yard tree giveaway program in the U.S. They've been around since 1990 and have given away over 500,000 trees since that time. And the whole point of the program is to reduce resident energy use through tree shade. So Sacramento, for those of you who haven't been there, it's in California's Central Valley. It's very hot every summer. The temperatures are routinely above 90 degrees and can get up to 100. And so in providing free shade trees, the utility district is really trying to reduce peak energy demand and avoid having to build another power plant. So it's a really powerful, powerful program. And this diagram shows a little bit more how it works. The Sacramento Municipal Utility District, they fund the program, they do quality assurance checks. The Sacramento Tree Foundation implements the program, and they have community foresters who travel around to visit residents and discuss what trees to plant and where to plant them and so forth. And then the residents themselves are responsible for tree planting and maintenance. So for the 5-year survival study, the goals were to assess the tree survival during the establishment phase, the first 5 years after planting, to evaluate risk factors for tree death and for failure to plant. And so the study pulled from over 13,000 trees that were delivered in calendar year 2007. We pulled a random sample of single-family residential trees. And I went driving all around Sacramento County for 5 summers in a row to check on how these trees were doing. Some of them were alive and in the ground, what we wanted to see. Others, like that picture in the middle, were standing dead. You can probably barely even see there's a twig in the ground that was once a tree in that lawn that is clearly not being watered. And then other times we saw trees that never made it into the ground to begin with. So those trees that you see still in a pot, those were next to a home that was foreclosed and vacant. So before I dive into the results, I think it's really critical that we get on the same page about what some different terms mean regarding survival. There are a lot of different terms about survival and lifespan that get tossed around in urban forestry, and it can be difficult to compare apples to apples when we're not necessarily referring to the same thing. So annual survival rate is the proportion of individuals surviving each year. Annual mortality rate is the proportion of individuals dying each year. So these are, again, annualized numbers. The annual mortality rate is 1 minus annual survival. And then we have these different terms, survivorship and survivability. And they're also used somewhat interchangeably by urban foresters, but it's really critical to tease them apart. Survivorship is the proportion of individuals surviving out of those planted. And that's really critical, those planted. Survivability, in the way that it's used by my colleagues at SMUD and the Sacramento Tree Foundation, when they use survivability, they mean proportion of individuals out of those distributed. And this can be best illustrated by giving some results. So of those trees that were delivered in 2007, only 85% of them were planted. A full 15% never made it into the ground. I'll get a little bit more into why in a few slides. Then of those trees that were planted, 88% made it to be alive in 2008, 12% died. So that 88%, that's survival in the first year or survivorship in the first year. But if we skip over the information about planted versus not planted, we come to 75% survivability. Again, it's really important to compare apples to apples when we're talking about survival rates. This next slide shows survivorship versus time since planting. So this is illustrating that at 5 years, we had 71% survivorship, which translates to 6.6% annual mortality. And this is higher than the mortality that is assumed for this program, and it's higher than most other assumed mortality rates in other kinds of population projections. And so what was associated with these different outcomes, the failure to plant and the post-planting mortality? So in areas that had lower educational attainment, that had fewer residents with bachelor's degrees, we found fewer trees were planted. And then in areas with more unstable homeownership, we found fewer trees planted. And what I mean by stable homeownership is that the same person or family who ordered that tree, they were a owner occupant, not a renter occupant, and they lived at that property for the duration of the study. Unstable homeownership would include renters, foreclosures, and non-foreclosure home sales. So then it turns out that homeowner stability was also absolutely critical for post-planting survival. So I did explore many other possible factors that could be related to post-planting tree loss, but the homeowner stability impact really dwarfed all of them. This graph here is showing that our survivorship curves are significantly different. So for unstable homeownership, we had 9.3% annual mortality. For stable homeownership, we had 5.2% annual mortality. And so I'm not going to get in too much under the hood with all the statistical approaches here, but there was a series of sophisticated multivariate analyses that led us to these conclusions. And if you want to chat more about that, I'm always available over email or for a phone call. So the stable homeownership thing was tightly related to maintenance. And so these residents are given educational packet describing the kind of stewardship that they should do, but they're often just failing to do that. We see here some trees that had their nursery stakes left in place, and then the ties are girdling them. We also saw many cases of no mulch or no structural support stakes. We saw instances of trees getting whacked by trimmers or weed whackers at their base. And so when we tallied up these different suggested maintenance practices, only a quarter of the residents were being good. Only a quarter of the residents were actually following what they were told to do. At the same time, though, we do have some trees that are growing and thriving as they should be. We, of course, want to see more of this. And the whole reason that the Sacramento Tree Foundation worked with me on this study was to really figure out how we could all do better, how we could try to get more trees surviving. So some conclusions from this 5-year study. First of all, observed mortality is higher than assumed mortality, and that's assumed mortality for this study system and assumed mortality for other kinds of population projections. And I would say from other kinds of literature, it seems that in general this statement is true, not just for this study. Next, it appears that most trees in this program are lost in the first year, and that is a combination of failure to plant as well as post-planting mortality. And although in the end we want to talk about, in some sense, survivability, that's the ultimate performance measure for these giveaway programs, but when we really want to understand the mechanisms, we should separate out failure to plant and post-planting mortality. There are two really different pieces of the puzzle in terms of the life history of these trees. Next, it seems that many residents are not following recommended maintenance practices, and so partly in a response to this study, the Sacramento Tree Foundation has started calling up all residents after the site visits, after they receive their trees. In the past, those conversations were a bit more sporadic after tree delivery, and now they're much more systematic about it. So the hope is that now that more residents are being gently nagged with these phone calls, that they will be following the maintenance they have been asked to do. And last but not least, that it's really critical to have stable homeownership to ensure tree survival. Now, after trees are given out through a program like this, we don't know what's going to happen in people's personal lives and their financial situation But there are different ways that programs might be able to reach back out to residents that might be new at that property. And also I should add that I happened to study or start this program at the height of the economic recession. Sacramento was one of the hardest hit areas in the country by the foreclosure crisis. And so it's possible that the results in terms of the stable homeownership issue might be somewhat different in another city that wasn't undergoing quite as many foreclosures as Sacramento has. So that's it. I'll close it out and turn it over to Jill and Yekang.